My grandson was 7 years old when I found the receipts. He had been volunteering at the children's charity after school, sweeping floors, sorting donations, the kind of thing that makes you proud as a grandfather. One evening, he left his backpack at my house, and when I opened it to put his lunch container in the sink, a manila envelope fell out. Inside were photocopied checks, bank statements, invoices for services that didn't exist. He had found them in a filing cabinet while looking for paper clips. He was 7 years old, and he had already figured out something was wrong. He just didn't know who to tell. What my grandson had uncovered inside the children's charity was not an accounting error. It was a pipeline. For every dollar donated to feed hungry kids in our county, 77 cents never reached a single meal. The money flowed through shell companies, consulting contracts, and vendor agreements that existed only on paper. This is a story about how a 7-year-old boy and a retired grandfather stumbled into the largest charity fraud scheme in state history. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when someone decides to look inside the filing cabinet and what it costs them to do the right thing. My name is Arthur Bellamy. I am 68 years old, retired from 39 years as a forensic accountant for the State Revenue Department. I spent my career following money that did not want to be followed. I have traced embezzlement through shell companies in 3 states, uncovered payroll fraud inside a hospital system, and once found a county commissioner who was billing the government for a fleet of vehicles that did not exist. I thought I had seen every way a person could steal. Then my grandson, Ethan, handed me a manila envelope he had pulled from a filing cabinet, and I learned I had not seen anything yet. Charity was called New Day Children's Promise. It served 4 counties in the southern part of the state, providing after-school meals, tutoring, and weekend food backpacks for kids who might not eat otherwise between Friday lunch and Monday breakfast. The founder and executive director was a woman named Patricia Denning. She had started the charity 14 years ago with a story that made every local paper. A single mother, formerly on assistance herself, who had built something from nothing. She had testified before the state legislature on childhood hunger. She had been photographed with 3 different governors. People in town called her Saint Patricia, and they meant it. Ethan started going to the after-school program when he was in 2nd grade. His mother, my daughter Julia, worked double shifts as a nurse at the county hospital. Ethan needed a place to be between 3 and 6, and New Day was 2 blocks from his school. He loved it at first. The volunteers were kind. There were snacks and board games and a reading corner. Patricia Denning herself would sometimes stop by and talk to the children, and Ethan would come home and tell me how nice she was. I was grateful. I wrote them a check every December. I had no reason to look closer. Then on a Tuesday evening in late September, Ethan forgot his backpack at my house. He was 7 years old, and forgetting things was part of his job description. I opened the main compartment to take out his lunch container, and I found a thick manila envelope that did not belong to a child. Inside were photocopies, bank statements, invoices, deposit records, about 40 pages in total. The paper smelled faintly of toner, the way office copies smell when they are fresh. I sat down at my kitchen table and I started reading. The invoices were made out to companies I had never heard of: Clearpath Consulting Group, Valley Fresh Provisions, Atlantic Marketing Solutions. Each invoice was for services related to the charity: food distribution contracts, program consulting, overhead management. I added up the numbers on the first 3 pages: $143,000 in a single month for a charity that served after-school snacks. I called Ethan the next morning. I asked him where he had found the envelope. He said he was looking for paper clips in the supply closet at the charity office, and there was a filing cabinet with a drawer that would not close all the way. He pulled it open to push the folders back, and the envelope was sitting on top of the files, not inside them. He said he thought it might be important, so he put it in his backpack to show me. He did not know what he had found. He was 7. He had found evidence of a crime, and he did not understand yet that some filing cabinets should stay closed. I spent the next 3 days at my kitchen table with that envelope and a notepad and a calculator. I ran the names of the companies through the state business registry. Clearpath Consulting Group was incorporated 18 months earlier and listed a post office box as its address. Its registered agent was a man named Gerald Denning, Patricia's brother. Valley Fresh Provisions had been in business for 3 years. Its sole officer was a woman named Maria Castellan. When I searched her name, I found a wedding announcement from 2 years ago. She had married Patricia Denning's nephew. Atlantic Marketing Solutions was owned by a holding company that was owned by a trust, and the trustee was Patricia Denning herself. Every invoice in that envelope was the charity paying Patricia Denning's family through companies that existed to collect checks and do nothing else. For every dollar donated, roughly 77 cents ended up with Patricia or someone she was related to. I had seen this before in my professional life. It was a textbook pass-through scheme. The charity raised money from donors and government grants. It paid the shell companies for services. The companies kept the money and delivered little or nothing, and the children got whatever was left. But here is the part that made me put down my pen and take a long breath. The programs that New Day claimed to fund were real on paper. They filed reports with the state showing meals served, tutors paid, backpacks distributed. The numbers were certified. They were also impossible. According to their filings, the charity served meals to 3,800 children every week across 4 counties. The total population of children eligible for those programs in those 4 counties was just under 2,100. They were claiming to serve more children than actually existed, and the state had signed off on it for years without a single audit. I realized something else. The dates on the bank statements were recent, within the last 6 months. The most recent statement was dated 16 days before Ethan opened the drawer. That meant the scheme was active, it was ongoing, and the filing cabinet that did not close properly had just released a piece of evidence that could bring the entire thing down. I called a man I used to work with at the Revenue Department. His name is Walter Cho, and he spent 25 years in the Fraud Investigation Division. I told him what I had found. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Walter. When I finished, he said 4 words: "Bring me the envelope." I drove to the Capitol the next morning. Walter and I met at a diner 3 blocks from the state office building, the way we used to do when we were working cases that required discretion. He spread the pages across the table. He was silent for a long time. Then he said Patricia Denning had been investigated once before, 3 years ago, after an anonymous tip about financial irregularities. The investigation had been closed within 6 weeks. No findings of wrongdoing. No charges filed. The case file was sealed. Walter said he remembered the investigator assigned to the case, a man named Carl Rossi. He said Rossi resigned from the department 8 months after the investigation closed. He said Rossi now worked as a consultant for a non-profit trade association in a different state. He said he had never been able to find out what happened, but he had always found it strange that a career investigator would leave a pension just 2 years short of vesting. I asked Walter what he thought we should do. He said he would open a new file quietly, through channels he still had access to, and flag the case for the state attorney general's office. He said it would take time. He said I needed to be patient. He said I should not tell anyone else what I had found. He said, "Arthur, if Carl Rossi closed an investigation, someone told him to close it. That person might still be in a position to make things difficult." I thanked him and I drove home. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a car parked across the street that I did not recognize. A dark sedan, late model, with municipal plates. The engine was off and nobody was inside. I made a mental note of the license plate number. When I woke up the next morning, the car was gone. 2 days later, Patricia Denning called my daughter Julia. She said she had heard that Ethan had been in the office supply closet and might have picked up something by mistake. She said she was missing a folder of documents, nothing serious, just some internal paperwork. She said she wondered if Ethan had taken it home. Julia called me after she hung up, confused. She said Patricia had sounded strange on the phone, tense in a way Julia had never heard before. She asked me if Ethan had brought home anything from the charity. I said I would talk to Ethan. I called Walter. I told him about the phone call, about the car, about the fact that Patricia Denning knew something was missing and had traced it to my grandson. Walter was quiet again. Then he said, "They know." I asked him what he meant. He said the investigation he had opened internally had been flagged within 24 hours. Someone in the system had seen the case file and notified Patricia Denning before Walter could get it to the Attorney General. I asked him who. He said he did not know yet, but the fact that she called Julia meant she was already moving. She was putting pressure on the edges to see what would crack, and she had started with my family. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after Walter told me about the flag. The envelope was in a locked drawer now. My grandson was at school, thinking about multiplication tables and recess. He did not know that a woman he trusted enough to call Miss Patty had already started working the phones to find out what he had taken. He did not know that a 7-year-old with a manila envelope could become a problem that grown people with things to hide would want solved. I called my daughter Julia and told her to keep Ethan home from the after-school program. I said I would pick him up myself. I did not give her a reason, I just said it was important. She trusted me, and she did not ask. That evening, I sat Ethan down at my kitchen table. I asked him to tell me everything about the day he found the envelope, every detail. He said the filing cabinet was in a back office that the kids were not supposed to go into, but the door had been left open. He said the room smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and there was a desk with a computer that had a screensaver of a beach. He said the envelope was not buried or hidden. It was sitting right on top, like someone had put it there and walked away in a hurry. I asked him if anyone saw him take it. He said he did not think so, but then he paused and said, "Miss Patty was in the hallway when I came out. She asked me if I got my paper clips. I showed her the ones in my hand. She smiled and said, 'Get a few more.' That meant Patricia Denning had watched him walk out of that office with his backpack. She knew, she had known from the moment it happened." The call to Julia had been her opening move, not her first instinct. She had spent 3 days deciding how to handle it. That terrified me more than if she had called the police. A person who takes their time to react is a person who is thinking several moves ahead. Walter called me the next morning. He had done some quiet asking around and found the name of the person who flagged the internal file. It was a deputy attorney general named Marcus Webb. I had heard the name before. Webb had been appointed 3 years ago after a career in private practice where his biggest client was a commercial real estate firm owned by none other than Gerald Denning, Patricia's brother. The same Gerald who was the registered agent for ClearPath Consulting Group, the shell company that billed the charity nearly $80,000 the previous year for program consulting that left no paperwork behind. Webb had been on Gerald's payroll. Now Webb was in a position to bury investigations before they started. Patricia had a man inside the system, and he had done exactly what he was placed there to do. But here is what Walter told me next, and it is the detail that changed everything. He said Marcus Webb was not the one who killed the original investigation 3 years ago. That was done by someone higher up, someone who is still there. Walter had found a redaction in the old case file that had been poorly done. If you held the page up to a light, you could see the name underneath. It was a state senator named Harold Crane. Crane chaired the oversight committee that controlled funding for the Attorney General's fraud division. He also happened to be the featured speaker at New Day's annual fundraising gala for 6 consecutive years. He had a framed photograph of himself with Patricia Denning on his office wall, according to a local newspaper profile I pulled up that afternoon. A state senator, a deputy AG, a charity executive, and her brother. This was not a case of one woman skimming cash from a donation jar. This was a network. I needed to understand how deep it went. I started by looking into the people who had worked at New Day and left. Charities like that have turnover. People come and go, and sometimes they go because they have seen something they were not supposed to see. I found 3 former employees who had been let go in the past 5 years. One was a bookkeeper named Sandra Keene who left in 2019 after what was described as a personnel dispute. She now worked at a grocery store 2 towns over. I drove there on a Thursday afternoon. I told her who I was and what I was looking into. At first, she did not want to talk. She said she had signed a severance agreement that included a confidentiality clause. I asked her if she had a lawyer look at that agreement. She said she could not afford one. I told her that confidentiality clauses cannot legally prevent someone from reporting a crime to law enforcement. She thought about that for a moment. Then she sat down at a table in the break room and told me everything. Sandra said that within 6 months of starting as bookkeeper, she noticed that large payments were going to vendors that had no physical address. When she asked Patricia about them, Patricia said they were consultants and that the board had approved everything. Sandra pushed harder. She asked to see the contracts. Patricia told her she was being insubordinate. 2 weeks later, Sandra was fired for poor performance. But before she left, she made copies. Not of the invoices, because those were locked down by then, but of something else. Internal emails. In one email, Gerald Denning wrote to Patricia saying that a certain payment needed to be routed through Atlantic Marketing Solutions rather than directly because Harold will have questions otherwise. Harold Crane, the state senator. The emails showed that Crane was not just a friendly face at fundraising dinners. He was actively helping them structure the flow of money to avoid scrutiny. Sandra gave me the emails. I took them home and added them to the folder in my locked drawer. The folder was getting thicker. I was beginning to understand the architecture of the fraud, but I still did not know where the money was ultimately going. The shell companies were pass-throughs. They collected the funds and then sent them somewhere else. I could not trace that final step without bank records I did not have. Walter said he could try to subpoena them, but we both knew that any official move would set off the same alarm bells that had killed the last investigation. I needed another way in, and that is when my daughter gave me the answer without realizing it. Julia called me on a Saturday afternoon. Ethan was with me, helping me rake leaves. She said she had been going through some old boxes in the attic and found a file that belonged to her ex-husband, David, Ethan's father. David had worked for New Day for about 8 months, 5 years earlier, before he and Julia split up. He left suddenly, moved to another state, and never came back. Julia had always described him as someone who could not handle responsibility. I had believed her, but now I asked Julia what was in the file. She said it was mostly old paperwork from his time at the charity. She said there was a notebook with a lot of handwritten numbers. She said it did not make sense to her. I asked her to bring it to me that evening. She did. I sat at my kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed, and I opened David's notebook. The handwriting was rushed but orderly, the way someone writes when they are trying to capture information they are afraid of forgetting. There were dates and dollar amounts that matched some of the payments I had seen in Ethan's envelope, but there were also names I did not recognize. Names of children. Next to each name was a dollar figure and a location. The locations were not addresses. They were camps, motels, private residences. One page had a column labeled transport and a column labeled services. At the bottom, David had written a single sentence and underlined it 3 times. They are not feeding them. I read that sentence and I felt a coldness move through me that I have not felt since I saw my first crime scene photograph as a young accountant working a homicide fraud case. I understood then that the money was not just being stolen. It was being converted into something else. The shell companies were paying for travel, for rooms, for access. The children that New Day claimed to serve did not exist on paper the way they should have, but some of them were real. The charity was not just fabricating meal counts. It was fabricating a system to move children through a pipeline that was never supposed to exist. The charity was a front, and the woman behind it had been called Saint Patricia. I called Walter at 6 in the morning. I read him the sentence from David's notebook. He was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "I'm calling the FBI." I told him about Marcus Webb and Harold Crane and the fact that the contamination might reach into every local office. He said he knew a special agent in the federal field office in the state capitol, a woman he had worked with before on a public corruption case. He said her name was Agent Teresa Okonkwo. He said she was not connected to anyone in the state political apparatus, and if anyone could keep an investigation quiet, it was her. I told him to make the call, and then I picked up the phone and called David. His number was disconnected, but I found him through a cousin of Julia's who still had his address. He was living in a small town in Ohio working construction. I drove 8 hours and knocked on his door. When he opened it and saw me, his face did something I cannot forget. It was not surprise. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for a knock on his door for 5 years and has rehearsed what he would say and is still not ready. He let me in. He made coffee. He said he had a sealed envelope in a safety deposit box at a bank 2 towns over. He gave me the key. He told me that 5 years ago, he had been a van driver for New Day, transporting children from schools to the after-school program. He noticed that some children were being picked up but never arrived at the program. When he asked his supervisor about it, he was told to mind his own business. He started keeping track. He discovered that a separate van was taking a small group of children to a property owned by Gerald Denning's company, a property listed as a retreat center, but that had no public programming and no oversight. He saw things there that he could not unsee. When he took his concerns to Patricia, she offered him money. When he refused, Gerald threatened to have him charged with crimes he did not commit. He was told that if he ever spoke about what he had seen, they would make sure he never saw his son again. So he left. He signed the papers. He disappeared from his own child's life to keep him safe, and he had been living with that choice ever since. I hugged my son-in-law for the first and only time in my life. I told him I was going to finish what he started. I drove home. I picked up Ethan from school. I made him dinner. I tucked him into bed and read him a story about a boy who went on an adventure. I did not let myself think about what I was about to do. I just did the next thing. The next morning, I retrieved David's safety deposit box. Inside were photographs, handwritten logs, and alleged detailing payments linked to children's names, dates, and locations across 3 county lines. He had compiled evidence of a child trafficking operation hiding inside a meal program, and I had it in my hands. I drove to the FBI field office to meet Agent Okonkwo. I sat in a waiting room with the evidence in a locked briefcase. I was told she would be with me shortly. 20 minutes passed, 30. Then a man in a suit came out and said Agent Okonkwo had been called away on an emergency. He asked if I wanted to leave a message. I said no and walked out. In the parking lot, my phone rang. A blocked number, I answered. A voice said, "You're a long way from home, Mr. Bellamy. Go back to your grandson while you still can." The line went dead. They knew I was there. They knew where Ethan was. I drove home at speeds I have not driven in 40 years. When I pulled into the driveway, Julia's car was there, but the front door was standing open. I ran inside and found Julia standing in the living room, her face white. She said Ethan had been playing in the backyard. She went inside to get him a juice box. When she came back out 60 seconds later, he was gone. 60 seconds, that was the window they needed. The backyard gate was unlatched. A neighbor later reported seeing a dark sedan pull away from the side street at the same moment Julia ran out the back door. Ethan was gone. I called 911, but I did not tell the dispatcher anything about the charity or Patricia Denning or the folder. I said my grandson was missing from our yard. I gave a description. I said I believed he was abducted. Then I called Walter. He did not say much. He said he would be at my house in 20 minutes. Then he said something I have thought about every day since. He said, "Arthur, they don't take children unless the children have already seen too much. That means Ethan saw something else, something he hasn't told you." I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had told me about the filing cabinet, and I tried to think. Ethan was 7. He had taken an envelope. He had been seen. Patricia had smiled and told him to get more paper clips. What else could he have seen? I opened the envelope again and spread every page across the table. The invoices, the bank statements, the deposit records. And then I noticed something I had missed the first 3 times. One of the bank statements had a small handwritten note in the margin in pencil. It was not David's handwriting. It was a child's. It said, "Miss Patty's special friends file 4th drawer back." Ethan had written it. He had seen the label on a drawer while looking for paper clips. The 4th drawer. I had not looked at the bottom of the envelope. There was another folded sheet. It was a photocopy of a document labeled Placement Roster with initials only, dates, and locations. The locations were not schools or camps. They were private addresses I did not recognize in 3 states. The sheet had a stamp at the bottom, "For bored eyes only, destroy after review." Ethan had copied it because he thought it was part of the same papers. He did not know what it meant, but Patricia knew he had been in that drawer. That was what she was afraid of. Walter arrived with a woman I had not met. She was tall, mid-50s, with short gray hair and the posture of someone who has worn a badge for a long time. She introduced herself as Agent Teresa Okonkwo, but she was not from the field office waiting room. She was from a different office entirely, the one in the city, the one that had not been compromised. She said the man in the suit who had turned me away was not an agent. It was a private security contractor hired by the charity's law firm to intercept me before I could make contact. He had been sitting in the parking lot, waiting. She had received Walter's message and met him at a separate location. She had been building a federal case against Patricia Denning for 11 months, working with a joint task force out of Washington. They had wiretaps, financial records, and testimony from 3 confidential informants. What they did not have was the placement roster. I handed her the sheet. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "This is bigger than we thought. We believed the trafficking was localized. This shows a tri-state network. But we still had a missing child. Agent Okonkwo made calls. Within 2 hours, the FBI had a tactical team stationed a block away, waiting for confirmation of Ethan's location. The problem was finding him. Patricia Denning had gone silent. Her phones were off. Her house was empty. Gerald's office was locked. The network was dark. And every hour that passed made it less likely that we would find Ethan before they moved him somewhere we could not follow. Julia sat on my couch with her phone in both hands, not speaking, not crying, just staring at the screen. I have seen grief before. I have seen what it does to people. But watching my daughter go through it was something I was not prepared for. I sat down next to her. I told her I was going to find him. I told her I was not going to stop until I did. She looked at me and said, "Dad, what if they hurt him?" I said, "They won't. They need him as leverage." I believed that. I had to believe it. The break came from an unexpected source. Sandra Keene, the former bookkeeper I had tracked down at the grocery store, called my cell phone. She was whispering. She said she had just received a call from a man claiming to represent New Day, offering her a substantial amount of money to sign a new confidentiality agreement, one that would extend to any federal investigation. The man had let something slip. He said, "We're consolidating assets at the lake house tonight." Sandra remembered that Patricia had a lake house in a small town called Millbrook, 40 miles north. It was listed under her brother's name, not hers. Sandra gave me the address. I handed the note to Okonkwo. She made one call. 15 minutes later, surveillance drones confirmed heat signatures inside the lake house. 3 adult figures, 1 small figure, Ethan. I wanted to go with them. Okonkwo said no. She said if I was seen, they might panic and harm Ethan. She said this was now a federal hostage rescue operation, and I needed to let them do their job. I have never felt as useless as I did in that moment. A grandfather sitting in his kitchen while people with guns and training did the work that should have been mine. But I stayed. I stayed because Julia needed me to hold her hand. I stayed because part of me knew that the fight was not over. Even if they got Ethan back, the network was still there. The people who had threatened my family were still in power, and they would not stop just because one child was rescued. At 11:42 that night, Okonkwo's phone rang. She listened for a few seconds, then turned to me and nodded. Ethan was safe. They had found him in a back bedroom, unharmed, watching cartoons on an old television. He thought he was on a trip. He did not understand what had happened. Julia collapsed against me and made a sound I cannot describe. I held her and I did not let go. Patricia Denning was taken into custody. Gerald was arrested at the lake house. Marcus Webb was picked up at his home an hour later. Harold Crane, the state senator, was notified that he was under federal investigation and that his office would be served with search warrants by morning. The network did not fully collapse, but the core of it was broken in a single sweep. But here is where the story takes a turn I did not expect. The next morning, I drove to the FBI field office to give my formal statement. I sat in a conference room with 2 agents who asked me to walk through everything from the beginning. I told them about Ethan's envelope, about David's notebook, about the placement roster. When I finished, one of the agents slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of a man I did not recognize, mid-40s, dark hair, glasses. The agent asked me if I had ever seen him before. I said no. He said the man's name was Peter Lassiter. He was the former executive director of a charity called Wonderwork, which had filed for bankruptcy in 2016 after a fraud investigation. The agent said Lassiter had been a silent partner in New Day Children's Promise from the beginning. He had helped Patricia set up the shell structure, trained her on how to avoid audits, and connected her with the network that moved children across state lines. Lassiter had been doing this for 2 decades, cycling through different charities, building up reputations, skimming funds, and trafficking minors. He had never been convicted. He was still free, operating under a different name in a different state. The agent said, "Mr. Bellamy, the case against Patricia Denning is strong, but she is not the head of this operation. She is a lieutenant, and the man at the top is still out there, watching, waiting to rebuild. The question is, are you willing to help us get him?" I looked at the photograph. I thought about Ethan, about the 7-year-old who had stumbled into a crime scene because a filing cabinet drawer would not close. I thought about the children whose names were on the placement roster, children I would never meet. I thought about Linda, my wife who had died 9 years ago, and the promise I had made to her before she passed, that I would protect this family with everything I had. I told the agent yes. I said I did not know what I could do, but I was in. He slid another folder across the table. Inside were surveillance photos, bank records, and a name. The name of the charity where Lassiter was now working. It was located in a town 60 miles from my home. It served lunch programs for elementary schools, and it was scheduled to receive a $10 million government grant in the next fiscal year. The cycle was about to repeat, with new children, new shell companies, and the same man pulling the strings. I drove home that afternoon. Ethan was in the living room building a Lego castle with Julia. He ran to me when I walked in and wrapped his arms around my legs. I picked him up. He said, "Grandpa, I don't want to go back to New Day." I told him he would never have to. I told him the bad people were going away. He asked me if the filing cabinet was still there. I said I did not know. He said, "Good." It smelled like coffee. That night after Julia and Ethan had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table. I opened the folder the FBI had given me. I started reading about Peter Lassiter, about his methods, about the charities he had built and burned. I realized that the fight was not ending. It was entering a new phase, and I was the one person who could move through the system without being flagged, the retired forensic accountant, the grandfather who was just looking for his grandson. The man they would not see coming. I said yes to the FBI because there was no other answer. Not for a man who had spent 39 years following money to its ugliest destinations. Not for a grandfather who had held his daughter while she waited to learn if her son was alive. Peter Lassiter had been doing this for 20 years. He had learned to build charities the way termites build tunnels, invisible from the outside, hollow on the inside. But every tunnel has an entrance, and I knew how to find it. The FBI called the operation's second chapter. They would use me as a civilian asset, someone with no badge and no official connection, to walk into Lassiter's new charity and get close enough to see the books. The charity was called Bright Futures Alliance. It provided school lunch programs in 5 counties. It had a storefront office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparer. The executive director was a woman named Carolyn Voss, who had worked with Lassiter at 2 previous charities. The board chair was a retired school superintendent with an unblemished reputation. On the surface, it was exactly what it claimed to be. I walked into their office on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 weeks after Ethan came home. I wore my Walmart jeans and my old windbreaker. I carried a folder of generic financial documents, the cover story we had built, a retired accountant looking to volunteer his skills, maybe join the board, give back to the community. I met with Carolyn Voss. She was pleasant and guarded, the way people are when they have been trained to screen for threats. She asked about my background. I told her I had worked for a regional accounting firm, mostly small business clients. I told her my wife had passed and I was looking for purpose. All of it was true, except the name of the firm. She smiled and said they could always use help with their annual audit preparation. She gave me a volunteer badge and a desk in a back room. For 2 weeks, I sorted receipts and entered data. I was careful. I did not ask too many questions. I let them get comfortable with me, and as they got comfortable, they got sloppy. One afternoon, a financial coordinator left her computer unlocked while she went to lunch. I saw a file directory labeled Consulting Payouts. I copied the folder structure onto a notepad, nothing digital that could be traced. That evening, I handed the notes to Agent Okonkwo. She had a forensic team reconstruct the network. It was the same architecture as New Day, shell companies, pass-through payments, family members on the payroll. But this time, the scale was larger. Bright Futures was processing government grants from 3 different agencies. The fraud was baked into the funding applications themselves. They were billing for meals that were never served, children who did not exist, in districts that had no record of the programs. And the money was flowing into accounts controlled by Peter Lassiter through an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. The FBI had enough to move on the financial crimes, but they needed more to make the trafficking charges stick. That required proving Lassiter was moving children, not just money. The evidence came from an unexpected source, my nephew Ethan, not directly, but one afternoon he asked me why Miss Patty had a special room at the charity. I asked him what he meant. He said there was a door in the back hallway that had a keypad lock, and sometimes kids would go in there with grown-ups and not come out for a long time. He said he thought it was a nap room. He had mentioned it once before, but I had not connected the dots. My blood ran cold. I asked him to draw the hallway, the door, everything he remembered. He drew a floor plan that matched the layout of Bright Future's office I had been working in. Lassiter had replicated the same design. I gave the drawing to Okonkwo. She obtained a warrant for thermal imaging of the building. Late one night, a surveillance team recorded a group of children being led through a rear entrance that was not listed on any floor plan. The room they entered had no windows. The next morning, the FBI raided the office. They found the room, and they found records inside a locked cabinet that detailed the movement of children across state lines. Lassiter was arrested at his home that afternoon. He did not resist. He had been expecting this for 20 years. When agents put the handcuffs on him, he said, "It's just business." But here is what I have learned about men like Peter Lassiter. They tell themselves it is just business because that is easier than admitting what they are. The truth was far simpler. For 2 decades, Lassiter had been using charities as a hunting ground. The children who came through his programs were poor, hungry, often with parents who worked multiple jobs and had no time to ask questions. He built a system that looked like feeding them and was actually feeding on them. The money funded the infrastructure. The infrastructure enabled the trafficking, and the trafficking generated more money, laundered back through the same shell companies that paid his salary. The circle was closed, self-sustaining, and almost entirely invisible to the oversight systems that were supposed to catch it. In the weeks after the arrest, the full scope of the network became public. Federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against 47 individuals across 6 states. 4 state legislators resigned. Marcus Webb, the deputy attorney general who had killed the earlier investigation, pleaded guilty to obstruction and conspiracy. Harold Crane was convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. Patricia Denning was sentenced to 22 years. Gerald Denning got 18. The shell companies were dissolved. The assets were seized. The children whose names were on the placement roster were identified one by one over the course of months. Some were found, some were not. For my family, the aftermath was quieter but no less profound. Julia quit her job at the county hospital and took a position at a private clinic with daytime hours only. She wanted to be home when Ethan got off the bus. She told me once, late at night, that she would never forgive herself for those 60 seconds she turned her back in the yard. I told her the same thing I told Nathan in the original case that started all of this. Shame is only useful if it leads somewhere. She has led it to a place where she holds her son tighter and watches the world more carefully. That is not nothing. Ethan is 9 years old now. He still builds Legos. He still forgets his backpack places. A few months ago, his class had a unit on community helpers, and he told his teacher that his grandfather had helped the FBI. The teacher called me confused. I explained as much as I could. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, I suppose that is one way to spend retirement." I laughed. Ethan asks me sometimes about Miss Patty and the bad people. I do not give him the details. I tell him he did a brave thing, even though he did not know he was doing it. I tell him that noticing things and telling the truth is the most important job a person can have. He seems to accept that. There is one more part of this story that I have not told publicly. It was the thing that kept me awake for many nights after the arrests. When the FBI searched Patricia Denning's lake house, they found a safe behind a false wall in the bedroom. Inside were bank documents, property deeds, and a small notebook with a blue cover. The notebook contained names of donors who had contributed large sums to New Day, along with notes about what each donor wanted in return. Some wanted tax deductions, some wanted access to political figures, some wanted something else. The notebook was 8 years old. It showed that the fraud was never just about the money. It was a marketplace of influence, and Patricia had been the broker. The FBI used that notebook to open investigations into 12 prominent figures in our state. 3 of them have been indicted. The rest are still under review. When I think about that notebook, I think about the filing cabinet that would not close. A 7-year-old looking for paper clips opened a drawer that led to a safe behind a wall that led to a notebook that may yet bring down people who thought they were untouchable. That is the thing about secrets. They are connected in ways you cannot predict. You pull on one thread and the whole fabric shifts. I am 68 years old. I still drive my old truck. I still buy my jeans at Walmart. I still fix my own plumbing when it breaks. The world has not changed, not really, but I have changed. I spent a lifetime tracing other people's crimes, and I thought that was enough. I thought doing the work behind a desk, writing the reports, handing them off to someone else was my role. I was wrong. Some fights require you to step out from behind the desk. Some fights require you to put your own family at risk because the alternative is letting someone else's family be destroyed. That is a hard truth. It is also the only one I have left. I keep a photograph on my desk now. It is not from the arrests or the trials. It is a picture Julia took last spring in our backyard. Ethan is holding a frog he found by the garden hose. He is beaming. I am standing behind him, my hand on his shoulder. The oak tree Linda planted the year Ethan was born is blooming behind us. It is an ordinary photograph. I look at it every morning before I start my day. It reminds me that the fight was never about the money or the headlines or the indictments. It was about making sure that boy could grow up in a world where the people who are supposed to feed hungry children actually feed them, where filing cabinet holds paperclips and not evidence of a crime, where a grandfather can teach his grandson to fish without worrying about who is watching from a dark sedan. We are not there yet, but we are closer than we were, and that is enough for now. There are more than 1.5 million nonprofits registered in the United States. They employ millions of people, distribute billions of dollars, and touch nearly every community in the country. The vast majority of them do exactly what they promise, but hidden inside that vast machinery of goodwill is a vulnerability that Peter Lasseter understood perfectly. Charities run on trust. Donors give money and assume it reaches the people who need it. Parents drop off their children and assume they are safe. Regulators read the reports and assume the numbers are accurate. Trust is the engine that makes the whole system run. And trust is also the door that someone like Lasseter can walk through without leaving fingerprints. The Charity Fraud Report found that 57% of charities identify over-reliance on trust as their primary vulnerability. That is not a coincidence. That is the architecture of the problem. When an organization is assumed to be good because it carries the word charity in its name, bad actors can hide in plain sight for years, sometimes decades. Patricia Denning was photographed with governors. Harold Crane gave speeches at her fundraisers. Marcus Webb sat in an office and buried investigations. The appearances were flawless because the system was not designed to look past them. But here is what I have come to believe after everything. The system is not what stopped them. It was people, a bookkeeper who made copies before she was fired, a van driver who kept a notebook and hid it in a safety deposit box, a 7-year-old boy who saw something strange and put it in his backpack, and a retired grandfather who had spent a career learning how to read financial documents and decided, at 68 years old, that he was not done using what he knew. The indictments, the convictions, the headlines, all of that came later. What came first was ordinary people deciding that what they had seen could not be ignored. The question that stays with me is this: how many filing cabinets are still out there, with drawers that will not quite close, holding documents that someone should have found years ago? How many children have walked past a door with a keypad lock and assumed it was just a nap room? How many people have signed confidentiality agreements because they were afraid and walked away from jobs, from communities, from their own families, carrying secrets that should have been told? The FBI cannot be everywhere. The regulators cannot audit every program. The system has limits, but people do not. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: pay attention. When something feels wrong, it probably is. When an organization is quick to silence questions instead of answering them, ask why. When someone tells you that certain doors are not for you to open, consider opening them anyway. You do not need a badge or a title or permission. You just need to be the kind of person who notices and who does not look away. Ethan is 10 now. Last week he asked me if there were still bad people running charities. I told him the truth. I said there probably were, but there were also good people watching, and he had already proven which kind of person he was going to be. He thought about that for a moment. Then he asked if we could get ice cream. I told him absolutely. My name is Arthur Bellamy. I am a retired forensic accountant, a grandfather, and a man who learned at 68 years old that it is never too late to open a filing cabinet. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel. Share this documentary with someone who needs to hear it. And the next time you see something that does not add up, trust that instinct. You might be the only person who does.